So there's Jackie Gabriel. Jackie is an assistant professor of sociology at Western Colorado University. She is a first-generation working-class college graduate and scholar, and her recent work examines working-class culture and social class in higher education. I know, Jackie, you're 7 hours behind us, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, even though it's really early. And I think we're all really looking forward to hearing your presentation, which is titled Skipping Class, Systematically Neglecting the Working Class in Higher Education.
Thank you, Molly. Also, thank you, Peter and Alex, for all you've been doing and helping this unfold the way it has been. Unfortunately, I haven't watched all of the sessions because when they start, it's 2 a.m. my time. So I'm thankful that they're being recorded and we can access them later. So with that being said, in my own PowerPoint, there are a few slides that I probably won't share or discuss in this 15-minute time span, but will be available for you to read at length, in detail later. I'll just try to go over them briefly. So if it seems like I'm skipping a couple slides, that's why, so that people that want to look at it later can have that information, but I probably won't address them all. Okay, if that makes sense. So Molly, you'll keep me to my 15 minutes, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
Then I'll go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you can all see it. So skipping class. Basically, I want to talk about how American universities in particular, and my institution, systematically neglect working class students, but also faculty, and then maybe give some kind of suggestions of what we can do differently. As bell hooks reminds us that nowhere is there more intense silence about the reality of class difference in educational settings. So I think first and foremost, we need to recognize social class and how it exists in many forms, from our students to our faculty to our staff in higher education. So when I ask my colleagues about the social class composition of their classrooms, they tend to be clueless, right? They look at me kind of strangely, like, what am I talking about, social class? And when I similarly ask about the faculty in their departments across my campus and other campuses about working class faculty, I get similar kinds of confused looks. So basically, because we don't see class different, we don't necessarily wear it on our sleeves. I think, yeah, we see it. We see it in the way we dress. We hear it in the way we talk. But it's neglected, and to some extent, I think purposely neglected in higher education. So I think that first and foremost, we need to be upfront about the social class composition of both our students and our faculty. And this is kind of a rhetorical question. Do your colleagues identify as working class? I ask across my campus and across US about colleagues identify as working class. And there's a number of reasons why faculty wouldn't identify as working class, because we'll be judged differently, right? We'll be evaluated differently, and our student evaluations will be questioned because of our lack of class knowledge, right? So there are reasons that we may be closeted, and there's a great literature on this in the United States, at least, on why working class faculty remain closeted. But I would argue that it's important for us to identify as working class, and particularly for our students. When I look at our university and universities across the United States, so if I look at my campus profile, there's a link there. And then also if I look at the National Center for Educational Statistics across the United States, that when we look at diversity and the composition of our student body, we track race and ethnicity, we track gender, but we neglect this other variable, which obviously needs to be considered in our conversation in the discourse about diversity and inclusion, and that is social class, right? So when the data is compiled, our university, when it shows diversity on campus, we have charts and graphs and data for race and ethnicity, even increasingly first-generation college students, which is a proxy to some extent for social class, but it doesn't match it perfectly, right? So there are a few arguments why institutions don't compile this data. And here are some of the arguments. I'm just going to be brief about this. That in the United States, social class is such a taboo subject, right? We all assume that we're classless. And the higher education does a good job of not just ignoring this or downplaying social class differences. Even in sociology, I found that in social inequalities classes and in introductory sociology, you know, a subject that should be looking at class structure, that we tend to assume that we're a classless society, and class is like caste in India, and we're not affected by it. So the fact that it's taboo means that we neglect it. There's also a lack of consensus of how to define or conceptualize social class, and then also how to measure it. But I think that that's an excuse. We can use proxy measures to get to social class, like Pell Grant eligibility, but we can also just ask students to identify as their social class. So there's ways to measure this. Even though imperfect, it's better to have some data or a proxy measure of social class than just to neglect it altogether. But the last argument, and I think that this is perhaps maybe the best argument, is that it's not in the institution's best interest to measure social class or to track social track and compile this data, because it affects our ranking as an institution. Right? So for colleges that want to climb up in the ranking system, that there's disincentives to recognize social class, because our working class students tend to take longer to graduate, tend to have lower exam scores, SAT and ATC scores, and they're less likely to graduate within 4 years. So there's a number of measures that would suggest that these students pose problems for institutions that want to be higher, find themselves higher in the ranking system. So you think that my university and a number of universities that have statements on diversity and inclusion, they really are failing to live up to those statements, given that they give lip service basically to diversity and inclusion. They have statements, but when we look at their just lack of looking at this data, recognizing the class difference, it would suggest that, you know, these statements are just statements rather than actual true missions of the university. Why it matters? Because if we really are committed to diversity and inclusion, we need to consider social class, right? By disregarding social class in our conversations regarding diversity and inclusion, we're doing a disservice to our students, but also to our faculty that find themselves in this culture that is largely middle class. So I guess what I'm getting at, and it seems a little bit redundant, but if we don't look at this data, if we don't compile this data, if we don't know this information, we can't really develop policies and practices that can be truly inclusive of our student body and also our faculty. Most of the discourse in the United States that looks at diversity glosses over social class again, right? That notion, measures or conceptualizations of diversity include race and ethnicity, sex and gender, and increasingly gender identity. And although these are very important, I don't mean to dismiss these to any extent, but by privileging those, we're also neglecting the social class differences, even though these obviously overlap. There's a relationship between race and ethnicity and social class. So I think that we need to reconceptualize diversity and inclusion, and you know, incorporate social class, because as we know, class is a variable that is correlated with nearly every other social indicator that we as sociologists care about, from health to wealth and whatnot. So there's plenty of literature that suggests that the culture of higher education is not inclusive, right? That working class students and faculty lack a sense of belonging, and that students and even faculty struggle in getting integrated and engaging in this typically middle class or upper class culture. If we look at survey data, that the majority of faculty and students from working class backgrounds report feeling isolated and marginalized by their colleagues, and for students, by their advisors, by their instructors, by their administrators. So if we want to think about retaining students and helping them succeed, and also retaining faculty and helping them succeed in higher education, we need to really address and bring social class into the discourse and think about ways to make the university less classist. I'm just going to go over a little bit of research. Again, this is in the PowerPoint so that you can look at it later. But if we look at some recent research that's done by some scholars, sociologists, we find that working class students report a lower sense of belonging on campus. Really no surprise. They find campuses are less welcoming to them, and they feel less involved. And there are some pragmatic ways in which we can incorporate these students, again, and faculty as well, into the university setting. First and foremost, I think that we need to, as I've suggested, collect better data. We need to really know the social class composition of our students and faculty. And we need to, again, open up discussions about class on campus in our classrooms, particularly sociologists, but also other disciplines and fields need to think about how social class is implicated in their discipline. And again, in reconceptualizing or thinking about our conceptualization of diversity and inclusion, social class needs to be a variable that's there, as well as race and ethnicity, sex, gender. Like we discussed male privilege and white privilege, I think we should also be discussing class privilege in our classrooms. Just simple things that faculty seem to overlook, and also administrators. When looking at students' ability to register, typically in the United States, students can't register until their financial aid goes through. So they can be the last to get into courses, or find themselves like closed out of classes because their financial aid hasn't gone through. So we need to think about how registration correlates to financial aid and allow equal access for students from working class background. Simple things like textbook costs, they affect our working class students disproportionately and our lower income students. So increasingly, my university and other institutions are going towards open education resources. But simple things like putting a desk copy on reserve at the library make a huge difference in the lives of our working class students. We also tend, at my university, and I assume at others, and literature suggests this, that we tend to disrespect or delegitimize students' employment while they're in school. The idea is that they're students and only students, but working class students have other responsibilities, financial and otherwise. They have responsibilities in their families, and they oftentimes work outside of school. So we need to acknowledge and legitimize their other responsibilities. There's research that suggests that working class students experience anxiety about talking in class and talking to their instructors and talking to their advisors. So I think that we need to recognize that and find ways to make our students feel comfortable talking to us. NPR recently had a story, National Public Radio had a story recently about how office hours are scary for working class and lower income students. So simple things like not just telling your office hours the first day of school when you go over the syllabus, but also explaining what happens during office hours, explaining to our students what happens during advising, I think are ways in which we can make them feel more comfortable. And then the whole alphabet soup of higher education of acronyms like MCC, AA, our students don't know what these terms mean because they're first generation and working class students. They're not accustomed to this language, and neither are their parents and friends. So I think that just getting rid of the jargon to a large extent can help incorporate our students. Great work recently out looking at how middle-class students assume a lot of time in the classroom, tend to feel like it's a secure place and that their teachers are there for them and should allow them space in the classroom where working class students don't. So teachers' evaluations of working class students differ based on, how many students raise their hand and what kind of space they're taking up in the classroom. Again, this research I'll leave on the PowerPoint so people can see, but extracurricular activities. I know at my institution, there's a push for internships and independent studies. Well, when our students are working full-time, outside of going to college full-time, they really can't be integrated into these unpaid internships or extracurricular activities. And research has suggested that middle-class students tend to get these opportunities, which helps create social networks and therefore, as you know, just recreates the class structure. Just a couple things I think that research suggests that the single most important avenue for support for working class students is faculty members that come from similar backgrounds and again identify as working class. So I think that as faculty we need to come out and we need to own that identity so that our students can identify with us and feel secure in reaching out to us, and we can be resources for them on campus. There's a growing literature that suggests that working class faculty are, they're documenting their experiences and they are indeed coming out. Language like class straddling and border crossing. So we see that more and more working class faculty are identifying as such. And the American Sociological Association has just created recently a task force on first generation and working class people in sociology, which I think is a good step forward. I'm going to exit my screen so that I can see all you again. I hope. I don't know if I'm over on time. I hope I didn't go into anybody else's time. But
no, you're just on time.
Okay.
I didn't say earlier, but if you've got any Q&As, questions, if you put them, if the attendees want to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll look through them at the end. But if there's anything that's super pressing, then we'll ask them just after the presentations. There's one question here that you've been asked. So it says, great paper on social class tracking. If universities are middle class domains, hence the resistance to openness, how do we break down the class barriers for the benefit of our disadvantaged students? Telling stories only goes so far. Our students listen, but senior management turns data and valuable missions into empty signifiers.
It's a great question. I wish I had a good answer. Again, I think that, do you want me to answer now, Molly, or do you want me to wait till the end?
If you need more time, then you can think about answer it after. It's up to you.
I think data matters, right? And I think that I kind of belabored that point, that I think that we need to recognize the degree to which working class people are in the academy, and first by acknowledging that in ourselves when we do, penetrate that class barrier and find our way experiencing social mobility in education, that we hold a tremendous responsibility to our colleagues and to our students who come from similar backgrounds to question these, lip service diversity statements like the one that I suggested earlier, that it's, we have a responsibility, I feel, and it puts a burden on us in a lot of ways, but I think that it's a burden that we share, and I think that we can work together to kind of solve some of these systemic issues.
I really loved your paper. I thought it was so good, and that's so much that I resonate. I was trying to make notes, but I just wrote single words everywhere.
I spoke really quickly, and I just wanted to keep it all in the time. So I'll put those slides up and add some more after the questions. I'll add some more comments onto my slides to share.